How do Jews deal ritually with death?
Most Jews do not observe the custom of the wake. Either at the mortuary or in the private home, since embalming is not customary. Cremation is not ordinarily done. Family members prepare. The body and burial ideally occurs within a day of death. Sitting Shiva refers to a 7 Shiva day period of mourning for a family member. Friends and relatives visit the home of the deceased to extend their sympathy and pray with the family. Every period of 7 days naturally includes a Sabbath. But on that day mourners refrain from manifesting their grief outwardly. Among Ashkenazic Jews in some countries, groups called Hevra Kadisa, Holy Brotherhood, may be available to provide burial services for the needy. The custom of observing the anniversary or yahrzeit of a relative's death involves visiting the grave and reciting the mourner's Kaddish, a prayer in praise of the Holy One whose dominion is everlasting.
Are cults different from sects? Are they authentically religious groups?
We've become accustomed in recent years to hearing about various cults, both here and abroad, that claim religious inspiration and legitimacy. Think, for example, of the Branch Davidians of Waco, Texas, the Heaven's Gate group Suicide in California, or the Japanese Aum Shinrikyo, infamous for its nerve gas attacks on Tokyo's subway system. The term cult is sometimes used synonymously with new religious movement. And although there are varying opinions on the subject, it is possible to point out a few salient features. First, both cult and new religious movement are historically relative terms. A movement whose novelty and exotic qualities were so obvious to observers, say 1,000 years ago, might have turned out to be a major religious tradition by our time. Most recent new movements are not truly sectarian in the sense that they are not offshoots of larger religious communities. In addition, cults take the exclusivity that seems to characterize the sect as classically defined and separate themselves from society to a much greater degree than sects. Cults tend to be quite small, often having only one very localized community centered around a charismatic leader who exercises virtually absolute control over members. Cult leaders sometimes claim their authority on the basis of a direct new revelation or special new insight and interpretation of mainstream sources such as the Bible. The leader's direct orders are often the only organizational structure. And when a cult leader dies, the cult often dies with him or her. Some cults seem to be oriented toward an end-time scenario and on occasion seem ready to do whatever they deem necessary to facilitate that end.
Are there any organizations or institutions that have their own distinctive structures of leadership within Confucianism?
Throughout history, various Confucian societies of laypersons have come and gone. Few of those have been more than local or regional. But since the Confucian community is composed exclusively of laity, there has been no Confucian priesthood, no religious orders, and no monastic life. The single most important organizational structure has been that of the literati class. With its elaborate hierarchy and system of advancement determined by examinations. Apart from that, Chinese authorities have often regarded as subversive all attempts to form separate groups within society as a whole. There have been times in Chinese history when prominent literati have withdrawn from society, opting for the eremitical life. These reclusive types borrowed a page from the Buddhist phenomenon of the solitary monk. But the Confucian hermits were by definition loners and not at all inclined to band together.
What are some of the main features of Buddhism's relationships to other traditions?
Buddhism's most important connections historically have been with Hinduism, out of which it grew, and the major indigenous traditions of the Asian lands to which it spread. Over the centuries, Buddhists have therefore interacted primarily with Hindus, Deists, Confucians, and adherents of Shinto. An earlier question outlined crucial features Buddhism's relationship to Hinduism. Here are some features of Buddhism's conceptual connections with the other traditions. China's ancient deist tradition made room for the Buddha among the swelling ranks of its deities, even claiming that foundational figure Lao Tzu had himself become a Buddha. Dharma, some scholars argued, was the Buddhist analogy to the concept of the way or Dao. They suggested further parallels between the Buddhist Arhat and the deist immortal, and between nirvana and the concept of non-action. Confucian tradition also found ways of accommodating to the newcomer. Some scholars saw in Buddhist ethics a parallel to Confucian filial piety. Even though Buddhist elevation of celibate monasticism seemed quite irreconcilable with the Confucian emphasis on family life. To Buddhism's 5 precepts some likened Confucianism's 5 constant virtues. When Buddhist missionaries brought the new teaching to Japan, the Buddha met the kami, high beings, of the indigenous tradition called Shinto. As was so often the case in China and elsewhere, Buddhism's ability to survive and grow in its new environment depended a great deal on royal patronage. Imperial support gave impetus to various Buddhist Shinto accommodations. Shinto's sun goddess, Amaterasu, became a counterpart to the Buddha of infinite light, Vairochana. Hachiman, Shinto deity of war, dressed as a Buddhist monk and became the guardian of the great Buddha. And in Mahayana teachings multiple Buddhas and Bodhisattvas some saw parallels to Shinto's countless kami. Representatives of various Buddhist denominations have continued active dialogue with other traditions, especially through the monastic connection.
Who were the Sadducees and are they still around?
Around the time the Pharisees became important players in Jewish history. The Sadducees, Tzaddukim, also emerged. They held that only the Torah was authentic revelation, repudiating the Pharisaic emphasis on the full Bible as well as all subsequent oral tradition. They also denied the Pharisees' teaching of the soul's immortality and bodily resurrection. As the Pharisees presented themselves as the heirs of Moses and of his authority as lawgiver, the Sadducees anchored their authority in that of Moses' priestly brother Aaron. More specifically, the Sadducees may have gotten their name because of their claim to be directly descended from Zadok, the high priest in Solomon's temple. The Sadducees had struck a compromise with the Hasmoneans, agreeing to support the rulers if they would officially nullify the Pharisaic teaching on the validity of the oral law. In exchange, the Sadducees would tolerate the Hasmonean claim to priestly authority, a stunning accommodation indicative of the enmity between Pharisees and Sadducees. When the Pharisees were restored to favor under the ruler Alexandra, 76 to 67 BCE, they in turn struck a deal by which they would sanction the priesthood of the Sadducees. In exchange for the Sadducees' acceptance of the binding force of oral Torah. During the time of Jesus, the high priest named Caiaphas was a Sadducee. But the sect disappeared along with the temple.
What are the principal historical stages in the evolution of Greater Hinduism?
A stage known as the Vedic period began as early as 4000 BCE. Some Indian scholars push the origins back as much as 3,000 or 4,000 years before that. Archaeological evidence from Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro point to a highly developed civilization in the Indus River Valley from around 2700 to 1500 BCE. Early texts suggest a religious culture centered on worship of numerous deities associated with forces of nature. Around 2000 BCE, there may have been a major population shift from the northwest of India to the Ganges plain as a result of the drying up of the Sarasvati River, once a prominent feature of the Indus Valley. The Vedic period comes to a close around the time of that shift. The period of the Upanishad scriptures and the Epic Age, from 1500 to 500 BCE, witnessed dramatic changes and the evolution of major new forms of religious expression. During these centuries, the Upanishads developed the speculative approach now known generically as Vedanta, the culmination of the Vedas. For the next millennium or so, 500 BCE to 500 CE, sometimes referred to as the classical period, new post-Vedantic sacred texts, called sutras, shastras, agamas, and earliest Puranas, formed the basis of a number of important schools of thought. From this period, too, came the written epics, the Ramayana and Mahabharata. Between around 500 and 1800 CE, the so-called medieval period, popular devotional theism, based largely on mythic narrative texts called the Puranas, spread across most of India. beginning with the arrival of the British in the mid-18th century. The modern period extends into the mid-20th century, the declaration of India's independence, and the partition that created East and West Pakistan as separate Muslim states.
Is number, letter, color, or animal symbolism important in Islamic tradition?
These and other types of related symbolism abound. The following examples provide only a hint of the variety of symbolism. Every letter in the Arabic language has a numerical value. A common use of number symbolism involves totaling up the numerical value of all the letters in a particular phrase and then using the number as a reminder of the phrase. For example, Muslims often repeat the phrase "in the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful." It is called the basmala, after the sound of the first three words. Bismillahi, ar-Rahmani ar-Rahim. The numerical value of all the letters in the phrase is 786, and the symbol appears often in a sort of sunburst design, in pictures of holy places such as the Kaaba. Letter symbolism is especially prominent in classical religious poetry in languages like Persian, Urdu, and Turkish. Poets love to play on meanings suggested by the shapes of the Arabic letters. As for colors, green has come to be known as the color of the prophets, and of Muhammad in particular. Animal symbols, too, have been widespread in many cultures. Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, Ali, was known as the Lion of God because of his courage. Shi'i artists in particular often included images of a lion when they wanted to suggest the spiritual presence of the first Imam, Ali.
What questions does the prospect of interfaith marriage raise for Hindus?
In India, with its vast Hindu majority, it is still largely taken for granted that young people will marry members of their own denomination or sect as well as of their own caste. Outside India, various external cultural pressures are changing such assumptions. Since Hindu tradition remains so intimately bound to cultural background, many traditional Hindu families would naturally prefer that their children marry other Hindus. By and large, the younger generation continues to do so.
What is the difference between a guru, an acharya, and a pandit?
A guru is a religious teacher who represents a particular lineage or spiritual tradition and is authorized to initiate qualified students into the tradition. Guru comes from a root that means heavy, grave, and suggests massive spiritual substance worthy of respect. Gurus have historically been distinguished according to certain specific tasks or offices. Those who perform the various rites of passage, and are particularly important in the rite of initiating young upper caste boys into Vedic tradition, are called teaching, shiksha, gurus. A teacher who represents a particular sect and initiates members into it is called an initiatory, diksha, or mantra guru. This guru passes along to the disciple, kila or shishya, a sacred syllable or phrase intended only for that individual. Gurus may be either male or female, and disciples often consider them direct descendants of the deity, with a claim to virtually absolute authority over their students. Many famous Hindu teachers throughout history have earned the title Acharya, often tacked onto a proper name as a suffix, as in Shankaracharya. The term identifies an individual who instructs others in right conduct. Many of those who have received the title have been famous philosophers and theologians. Finally, anyone who watches news coverage around election time will invariably hear commentators referred to as political pundits. In the history of Hinduism, a pundit is a person learned especially in a broad spectrum of oral tradition and practical lore. The scope of the pundit's learning was less specialized than that of the guru, who focused on a higher wisdom aimed at liberation of the soul. Nowadays pundits are generally from families of Brahmins dedicated to transmitting knowledge of the sources from memory, much the way the ancient rabbis preserved Judaism's oral Torah. In short, these three roles complement each other. Pundits have maintained the tradition as accurately as human memory allows. Acharyas further develop the tradition, reflecting on its deeper implications. And gurus help seekers to apply the tradition's wisdom to their personal spiritual lives.
Do Jewish communities run private schools for their children?
Educational institutions called yeshivot, academies, plural of yeshiva, began to proliferate in Iraq. In communities that grew out of the exile, and in Israel especially after the temple was destroyed in 70 CE. Tradition credits Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai with founding the first academy at Jabna in Israel. Since the Sanhedrin had been housed in the temple, it found a home at the academy. Academies in Iraq began in the 3rd century CE at Sura and Nehardea, and later at Pumadida. As the center of Jewish life shifted from the Middle East to Europe during medieval times, academies arose in Central and Eastern Europe. Famous biblical scholars such as Gershom ben Judah, 960-1040, and Rashi, Shlomo bar Ishak, 1040-1105, founded major schools in Mainz, Germany, and Troyes, France, respectively. The traditions, if not the actual structures, of these and other scholarly dynasties have continued into modern times. Many local Jewish communities maintain schools for younger students, emphasizing the study of Hebrew. Orthodox Jews typically refer to synagogue as shul, German/Yiddish for school, emphasizing the study and discussion of scripture and Talmud. Rabbinical seminaries, such as Yeshiva University in New York, Now offer advanced learning in Jewish tradition in the context of training for the ministry.
What are the Four Noble Truths?
Enlightenment means grasping the fundamental realities. Summed up in Buddhism's Four Noble Truths, life is difficult. All hardship and suffering comes from inappropriate attachment or grasping. To avoid suffering, avoid inappropriate craving. To stop inappropriate craving, follow the Eightfold Noble Path.
What about lesser or subordinate popular deities?
Associated with Maziu is the great emperor protecting life, Bao Shen Da Di. A physician during medieval, Song dynasty, times, he remains a popular healing power. Legend says that he suffered from unrequited love for Maziu. Xiao Lao, god of longevity, appears often in Chinese art and in temple decorations. He holds a peach and a staff, walks with a crane or a deer or both, and has an exceptionally high forehead and a long white beard. Another god of longevity, Xiao Xing, has the responsibility of appointing each person's time of death. Like Xiao Lao, he holds a peach, but Xiao Xing's companions are the stag and bat. He is sometimes depicted as one of a trinity of star gods of happiness. Dozens of other lesser gods fill out the popular pantheon. Dongfang Shuo is the divine patron of metalsmiths. Connected with the planet Venus and depicted standing on gold and silver ingots. Bianho is the patron deity of jewelers. Ming, a deity of deist origin, became the kitchen god, or director of destinies, who oversees the fates of family members and submits reports annually to the Jade Emperor on how each person is progressing. Depicted as an elderly mandarin, this household deity rules from his place above the family hearth.
What do Christians believe about divorce and remarriage?
Whether or not the witnessing community regards matrimony as a sacrament. Christian groups universally teach that marriage is a permanent commitment. Unfortunately, there is often a large gap between ideals and realities. However common it has become in some societies. Most Christian communities consider divorce a solution of last resort. Many churches train their ministers and priests in marriage and family counseling so that they can assist their members when they find their relationships threatened for whatever reason, in the hope of obviating the eventual need for divorce. Some churches recommend or even require premarital counseling and education, designed to impress on the couple the nature of the commitment they envision. Some churches do not recognize divorce as a religiously acceptable choice, teaching that marriage is an indissoluble bond. but those churches also acknowledge that in some cases the parties in a marriage may not have made the commitment with sufficient maturity, proper intent, or full consent. In those instances the marriage can be annulled, allowing both parties to seek legal divorce and remarry if they choose.
Do people ever decide they want to depart from the Shinto community?
Membership in traditions so closely identified with ethnicity as Shinto has a great deal to do with trends in society generally. That is of course true of most religious traditions. But here there are several features about Shinto worth noting. Japanese ethnicity does not imply adherence to Shinto beliefs and practices any more than Jewish ancestry implies that an individual actively participates in Judaic religious traditions. Shinto is integral to the fabric of Japanese life. Large numbers of Japan's present population do not engage in regular Shinto rituals at all. And many others are very selective as to their involvement. But that does not imply a deliberate choice to reject the ancient traditions as such. It does, however, underscore the impact of cultural and social change on all things traditional. Shinto tradition calls people to unhurried, careful attentiveness to the mysterious details of life. In a fast-paced, often tumultuous world, the drumbeat of change can easily drown out the sound of the drums that announce the beginning of a sacred ritual.
What special rituals do Christians engage in at home?
In Jewish tradition, the home continues to be the center of religious life and education. Many Christians tend to think of church as fulfilling that purpose. As a result, there are few Christian rituals universally associated with the home. Among the few common practices Christians report as important to them are shared reading of Scripture and group prayer. Whether in connection with meals or as a distinct activity. If there is one religious activity that qualifies as a regular ritual in the majority of Christian homes, it is probably the practice of bedtime prayer with the children of the house. This can be a powerful formative influence on young Christians, because they can learn to include others in the orbit of their religious concern. Praying for thus becomes a way of connecting spiritually with the rest of the world.
When were instituted the first public schools in ancient China?
The first public schools date back to ancient China. Confucius was among the first in China to advocate that primary school education should be available to all. He averred that in education there should be no class distinctions. He never refused a student even though he came to me on foot, with nothing more to offer as tuition than a package of dried meat. Confucius asserted that any man including a peasant boy had the potential to be a man of principle.
How do religious communities structure their internal administrations?
Structure and organization generally relate more or less directly to the role and shape of authority within a religious tradition. There are, for example, various levels of organization such as denominations and sects. Here one finds a variety of structures ranging from rigidly hierarchical to egalitarian. Hierarchically oriented traditions, such as Roman and English Catholicism, 12-er Shia Islam, or the Mormons, often feature a pyramid of power capped by a single figure who can wield enormous moral and juridical authority. Just below that leader there is sometimes a rank or two of administrators who hold jurisdiction over specified territories within the tradition's geographic expanse. In some cases those top administrators may form a deliberative body or council that advises the leader in matters of tradition-wide importance. On the next rung or two down toward the base of the pyramid there will typically be ranks of administrative and pastoral offices charged with the daily affairs of the smallest community units where most members gather. Smaller religious traditions enjoy the practical luxury of opting for more egalitarian structures with fewer administrative offices. Whether large or small, all traditions have to deal with the practicalities of how their administrations are chosen. In some hierarchical structures the top official is elected by the members of the highest deliberative body, whose members in turn are appointed by the head. In others, such as Shia Islam, the process by which both the head and those next in rank are chosen is more a matter of public acclaim. In still other traditions with prominent official classification, such as Temple Hinduism and Shinto, the priesthood is often associated with family and heredity and is typically entered for life. In the most egalitarian communities, all administrators are chosen democratically, serving either for set terms of office or indefinitely at the pleasure of the local community.
Is there such a thing as a saint in Confucianism?
Confucius revered the ancient kings as sages, Sheng, figures of towering intellect and virtue who represented an ideal never again to be attained by mere mortals. Their inimitability prevented the ancients from functioning as exemplars and restricted them to the role of venerable ancestors to whom all owed a debt of gratitude. Meng Zhi began to modify the role of the sage. He suggested that the sage appears in every age, not only in the distant past, and he emphasized the sage's humanity and imitability. Individuals could aspire to and cultivate the qualities of the sage through education. With the Song dynasty came Neo-Confucianism and a further expansion of the sage's role. Building on the classic text called The Great Learning, de Shui. Medieval scholars spoke of a series of stages through which an aspirant could advance toward the lofty goal of sagehood. Neo-Confucians identified the sage as the individual who had fully actualized all moral and intellectual potential and arrived at a state of oneness with the universe. Like the Daoist sage, as described in the Dao De Jing. The Confucian sage embodies perfect harmony with the cosmos. Unlike the Daoist sage, the Confucian puts wisdom's insights to work by active involvement in the ordinary affairs of society. A Confucian sage is like the Buddhist bodhisattva in that both are committed to the betterment of the human condition. The 10-stage bodhisattva career offers a general parallel to the Neo-Confucian system of steps toward sagehood. But whereas the bodhisattva has the power to reach down and change the plight of those who ask for help, the sage offers the hope of transformation through determination and effort. Sages model the best in Confucianism's spirituality of public service.
Who are the 8 immortals?
Three historical and 5 legendary persons believed to have achieved immortality figure prominently in Chinese religious lore. Daoist sources tell of many other mortals who have achieved immortality. But these 8 are especially important. Chinese religious lore contains many sets of 8 trigrams, precious objects, cosmic directions, for example. The immortals, Xian, are in some ways analogous to Christianity's saints and Islam's friends of God. Lu Dongbin, originally a patriarch of the Complete Realization School during the 8th century, generally leads the group. He usually dresses as a scholar and carries a fly whisk. Some images show him with his magical sword. One of the 8 Daoist emblems. Lu is patron of barbers and is celebrated for his healing powers. Li Taiguai, a purely legendary figure whose emblems are the gourd and crutch, appears as an old crippled beggar. He champions the weak and marginalized and is a patron of pharmacists. Zhang Guolao lived sometime between 650 and 750 CE. Capable of making himself invisible, Zhang appears riding, often backwards, on a white mule which he could roll up and tuck into his sleeve. His emblem is the percussion instrument made of a bamboo tube and 2 sticks, and he is the patron of elderly men. He Xiangu, the lone female of the group, holds a bamboo ladle, a lotus or basket of flowers, and sometimes the peach of immortality. She is said to have lived around 700 CE and is noted for her asceticism and kindness. Han Xiangzi is the patron of musicians. He carries a flute and is known for his spendthrift ways and delight in mountain solitude. Zhongli Chuan is supposed to have been a soldier of old who failed in battle and became an alchemist. Apparently once a historical figure. The aging and portly fellow eventually ascended to heaven on a stork and now carries a fan. Lan Cai is a strange figure among strange figures. With 1 foot bare and 1 shod, sometimes appearing as a woman, sometimes as a boy. He carries a basket of flowers and is patron of florists. Cao Guoju, patron of actors, carries a pair of castanets or, alternatively, a jade court tablet that was his entry pass and from which the image of castanets may have developed. Tradition makes this 8th immortal the brother of a Song dynasty empress and dresses him in royal finery. The whole octet are still widely popular and sought out for their magical powers.
Do Muslims believe in the devil?
Within the larger category of jinn are many beings who were once angels. The principal diabolical figure is called Iblis, pronounced Iblees, from the Greek diabolos. God ordered him to do homage to the newly created body of Adam, but Iblis refused, arguing that a creature of fire need not bow to one made of clay. God banished Iblis from paradise and he became the personification of the choice for evil over good. It was Iblis who tempted Adam and Eve, Quran 2:35-39, 7:19-25, 20:120-121. Tradition also names the devil Shaitan, Shaitan, and often refers to many Satans. The lesser minions of Iblis who fan out to beset humanity with temptations of every kind. Some of Islam's mystics have focused on the story of Iblis' fall as an occasion for discussing the infinite mercy of God. As evil as the devil is, they argue, even Iblis still has hope of enjoying the transforming power of divine forgiveness at the end of time. The mystics are not suggesting that the devil is soft on sheer nastiness. Only that no power in the universe can compare with God's mercy.
What is the relationship between Daoism and nature?
According to Daoist tradition, all things naturally exist in a primordial harmony. When things go wrong, whether in nature or in human society, the cause is invariably an imbalance in the equilibrium of yin and yang that results in a blockage of the flow of natural energies. Qi. Part of the problem is the human tendency to seek control. When that desire leads to ill-conceived attempts to dominate nature, the outcome can only be disastrous. Nature yields its abundance easily and graciously to all among the 10,000 things. Creatures, that are willing to receive without grabbing or hoarding. When human beings develop a warped notion of their place in the larger scheme of things, attempting to force their will, all of nature may suffer temporary setbacks. But in the end, nature's balance will return. Traditional Chinese landscape paintings say it much better than words can. Massive mountains loom in the upper part of a hanging scroll, their craggy peaks bathed in sunlight. From the heights a waterfall cascades into the valley below. forming a lake as the stream emerges into the plain. Tucked away in a mountain scene, a tiny human figure sits meditatively in a picturesque pavilion. Further below, an unobtrusive figure shoulders a load across a small bridge. A solitary fisherman drops a line from his slender craft. Between valley and peaks, or perhaps where the peak imperceptibly becomes valley, hangs a misty cloud of that cosmic force known as chi. Landscape paintings, called mountain water pictures, thus suggest the perfect balance between yang and yin.
What is the significance of keeping kosher?
Kashrut is the Hebrew term for the use of ritually pure, kasher, food. It refers to the way food is prepared as well as to certain types of food. With respect to manner of preparation, the opposite of kasher is terfa. Torn by a predator, rather than properly butchered. The basic principle here is that an animal's death by predator constitutes a defect in the animal product. Proper butchering, called shehita, involves using only perfectly smooth blades to slit the animal's throat and windpipe, draining the blood, and inspecting for blemishes. With respect to types of food, Jews make a number of major distinctions between what is clean and what is unclean. Clean animals include cattle, sheep, and other ruminants with fully cloven hooves, but not non-ruminant mammals or those with solid or only partly cloven hooves, such as dogs or horses. Clean birds include pigeons, doves, chickens, pheasant, and domestically raised geese and ducks, but not birds of prey, wild waterfowl, or most other common wild birds. All reptiles and amphibians are unclean, but fish with scales and internal bones, as opposed to cartilage, as with shark, are acceptable. In addition, expanding on the biblical prohibition of cooking a kid in its mother's milk, Exodus 34:26, dairy and meat products may not be combined in any way. Strict observers of kashrut keep separate sets of kitchen tools, some even totally separate kitchens for meats and dairy products. Kosher practice is an excellent example of the distinction between custom and ritual. Observance of dietary laws often involves, or presupposes, precise ritual action, such as in the kosher method of slaughtering an animal or the care taken not to contaminate utensils. But in general it means simply a customary way of handling food that has religious implications.
Have there been any major ascetics in the history of Christian spirituality?
Asceticism is an intensely focused spiritual striving that emphasizes various forms of self-discipline. According to the New Testament, Jesus himself led a simple life and taught his followers that it was preferable to possess only the basic necessities. He counseled followers to deny themselves luxuries if they wished to follow him. Jesus did not recommend extreme forms of self-denial as such. Nevertheless, individuals and small groups throughout Christian history often have interpreted the gospel preference for simplicity and non-attachment in dramatic ways. Some Christians have engaged in strict fasts, arduous penances, and occasionally even self-mutilation. Several early Christians sat atop pillars. Some had tiny huts, somewhat like tree houses, for lengthy periods. These Stilites took their cue from Assyrian, Simeon, c. 390 to 459, to whose pillar many pilgrims came to pray and to send up a few supplies. Pillar ascetics were not uncommon in the Middle East for about 500 years. The ideals of the Desert Fathers, who began the monastic movement and called their followers to a life of voluntary poverty and solitude, are still emphasized by such strict religious orders as the Trappists.
Do Muslims mark their sacred spaces with any distinctive signs and symbols?
Drive by the mosque nearest you. There is probably one not very far away, and you are likely to notice two distinctive features. Attached to, or alongside, the building you will see one or perhaps two slender towers called minarets. Originally designed to provide maximum broadcast of the call to prayer, the minaret eventually became a visual symbol of Islamic presence. Most structures designed as mosques feature a dome of some sort, typically spanning the central interior space called the prayer hall. Many synagogues and Eastern Christian churches also use central domes, but generally do not have towers that one might mistake for minarets. Atop some minarets and domes you will find a finial in the shape of a crescent moon encircling a single star. Some communities choose to have their mosques reflect architecturally a particular national or regional heritage. They might hire, for example, an Egyptian architect to design in a neoclassical Egyptian style, as with the National Mosque in Washington, D.C. Or they might choose to incorporate into the design some visual allusion to a particularly important mosque, the way the new Islamic Center of Cleveland aligns a large central and a smaller secondary dome, recalling the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. Interior decorations typically feature elegant calligraphic texts, either painted or carved in marble or other stone, of the names Allah and Muhammad, and of the Shahada and Basmala, and possibly of any number of the 99 beautiful names of God. Calligraphic decoration often appears around the drum of the dome and around the niche on the wall facing Mecca. Prayer rugs or carpeting sometimes show niche designs like that of the mihrab, pronounced mi'raab, niche. And somewhere in the mosque there will more than likely be a large picture of the sanctuary of the Kaaba in Mecca, and possibly also of the Prophet's mosque in Medina.
Are there other distinctive Shinto rites of passage or initiation?
Several types of ceremony and celebration are associated with various stages in life. Tradition recommends that parents, formerly the grandmother, since mothers remained impure for a time after childbirth, bring 32-day-old boys or 33-day-old girls to the shrine for a special blessing. This first shrine visit, Hatsumiya Mairi, functioned as the infant's initiation into the Shinto shrine community. Older children also have their days. Each November 15th, a festival called Shishigo-san 753, marks a rite of passage for both boys and girls. 3 and 7-year-old girls and 5-year-old boys don their fanciest dress-up outfits for a shrine visit to pray for a safe and happy future. Putting on special clothes is a major ingredient in rites of initiation. Young people reach the age of adulthood at 20. On Coming of Age Day, see Jinohai, January 15th each year. Young adults, especially women, visit shrines in formal attire for a blessing. Other coming-of-age observances identify manhood with age 17 and womanhood with 19. Acknowledging the difficulty of life's changes with the bestowal of protective talismans. Many older Japanese still observe rites of passage that acknowledge the challenges of aging. They may visit shrines when they reach the ages of 61, 70, 77, 88, and 99. To ask for protection and blessings.
Where do deists live today? Are any estimates of numbers available? How about CCT?
Until fairly recently, Daoism has been an almost exclusively Chinese phenomenon. Since the Maoist Revolution of 1949. Practice of Daoism in the People's Republic of China has diminished dramatically. Buddhism had the advantage of being an international tradition and thus of at least limited political utility. In addition, Buddhism qualified officially as a religion while Daoism was defined as mere superstition. Daoist temples and monasteries were shut down or destroyed and thousands of Daoist ritual specialists had to seek other means of livelihood. Things have taken a turn for the better since the 1980s. Monasteries have reopened, and as of 1995 counts, Daoist temples number over 600, with about 10 times that number of nuns and priests. Some institutions have even managed to revive formal seminary training for ritual specialists. The Celestial Masters School and the Monastic Order of Chuanzhen Complete Realization School are the liveliest Daoist organizations in the People's Republic now. Many hundreds of temples are active in Hong Kong and Taiwan. Many more belonging to CCT than to specifically Daoist groups. Elsewhere in Asia, wherever significant populations of Chinese have gathered, such as Malaysia and Singapore, Daoism and CCT are growing but are still relatively small. Active Daoists may number several million. while adherents of CCT may number between 100 and 200 million. These numbers seem relatively small next to counts of other major traditions. But they do not include the many millions of people whose days are full of ancient symbols and small rituals. Even if they are not formally identified with the institutional trappings of Daoism or CCT.
Are there any other important Daoist sacred figures?
One important subordinate deity is Xiantian Shangdi, Supreme Emperor of Dark Heaven. The Jade Emperor dispatched him to Earth to battle a band of renegade demon kings. His iconography shows him enthroned and using a serpent and a turtle, leaders of the demons, as a footstool. A legendary woman named Shi Wangmu, also known as the Queen Mother of the West, figures prominently in some Daoist writings. She is a patroness of immortality, often depicted in the company of jade maidens, one carrying a fan and the other a bushel of the peaches of longevity. Ruling the east is her divine consort, Dung Wangong, who lives in the remote magical fastness of the Kunlun Mountains. In a reversal of the more usual dynamic, a god of walls and moats, also known as the city god, began as a popular deity and made his way into the Daoist pantheon. During certain periods in history, the heavenly master appointed a given city's tutelary deity. City god has the assistance of several other figures, called spirit secretaries, in the idiom of public administration. They help the city god deliver his reports on the conduct of citizens to the authorities in hell. A goddess named Domu, mother of the bushel of stars, or northern dipper, functions in Daoism much the way Guanyin does in Buddhism, offering limitless compassion for the suffering. Some other potent beings are clustered in groups. The Sennin are a group of sacred figures who dwell in heaven or in the distant misty mountains. Among the Sennin, the most important are the 8 immortals. Originally persons either historical, 3, or legendary. 5, they function as guardian figures of Daoism. Although they are not officially divine, popular lore sometimes attributes divine powers to them. They are called later heaven deities, as are all human figures who eventually achieved immortality.
Do millennialism or messianism have a place in Confucian thinking?
Confucius was far more concerned about the present and its relation to the past than about possible but distant futures. He was keenly interested in offering people hope through the cultivation of a balanced society. Some have suggested that Confucius was very much a utopian, in that the society he sought to foster was destined to remain an unattainable ideal. In any case, Confucius did not envision any kind of inevitable cataclysm, an end of time at which the world of history would implode in a cosmic conflagration. Confucian thought has been intimately associated with the traditional Chinese reckoning of time. That includes cycles of 60 years, but those cycles do not carry apocalyptic implications. There have been millennialist and messianic movements in Chinese history, but none of importance has arisen out of Confucian or literati circles. However, some scholars detect in Confucian history elements that have a messianic tone. According to that view, Confucius himself may have fulfilled expectations of a messianic ruler nurtured as far back as the legendary Shang dynasty.
Is there a distinctively Buddhist ethic?
Compassion for all sentient beings is the overriding principle in Buddhist ethics. It was compassion, karuna, that urged the Buddha to share his message of enlightenment. Life's greatest challenge is to act out of genuine altruism. To be and do for others without hoping for reward. Compassion needs to be doubly disciplined. One needs to work toward the alleviation of suffering purely because that is humanity's highest calling. But it is also essential to know how best to put compassion into action. That calls for the practical wisdom that comes from a keen awareness of one's own spiritual history, including a recollection of one's previous lives. The ability to recall one's former existences is a mark of genuine enlightenment and a sign of profound awareness. Buddhist ethics combine the compassion of one who appreciates the pervasiveness of suffering with the practical wisdom that comes from a detailed experiential knowledge of what works. The result is a virtue called skill in means, upaya. In other words, it is the motive for behaving ethically compassion. The framework within which to choose a course of action wisdom, and the resources with which to act.
Is there a distinctively Jewish ethic?
Every major religious tradition has its equivalent of the Golden Rule: treat others as you would like them to treat you. One classic Jewish version says, "Do not do to others what you would not want others to do to you." As a humanistic guide, it is very important, and pretty obvious on the face of it. But no religious tradition has ever just left the matter there, hoping their members would work out the details. Most readers will be familiar with the expression Judeo-Christian ethic. Politicians and preachers alike are fond of using the phrase as a handy, if rather vague, summary of values espoused by large populations like those of the United States. The term does not suggest that there are no significant differences between Judaism and Christianity as communities of faith. But it clearly implies that Jews and Christians generally agree on basic ethical principles. Most people would instinctively identify the Ten Commandments as that shared foundation of morals. But since for Christians as well as for Jews, the Decalogue functions as an ethical minimum, there is much more to both approaches to morality than one can squeeze into a handful of commands and prohibitions. This is where religious motivation enters the mix, making each tradition of religious ethics distinctive. Jews strive for a moral life because, in addition to the need for basic mutual respect, golden rule, and for broad guidelines meant to prevent social chaos. The Decalogue, the revealing God, demands nothing less of believers. Some Jews also draw motivation from the prospect of reward or punishment in the next life. Many find it sufficient that God has given all good things and wants people to share them so that more people can enjoy the gift of life. Since life's gifts don't always simply fall into one's lap and take care of themselves, believers need to work toward worthy goals and care the gifts attained.
So what happens in Buddhist mysticism?
Some sources talk of realizing the emptiness of all things. Profound experience of the meaning of the Four Noble Truths transcends all ordinary levels of awareness. It is possible to attain nirvana in this life. Nirvana with the remainder. They call it, and that means full insight into the way things are. One who arrives at such a state of objectless contemplation might justifiably be called a Buddhist mystic.
What does the term dual Shinto mean?
Dual, or Ryobyu, two-sided, Shinto arose out of the early interaction between Shinto theology and Buddhist thinking newly imported from China. Some use the term Ryobyu-shigo, dual compromise, to describe the resulting syncretism. Some accounts describe the developments this way. In 715 CE, a Shinto shrine annexed a Buddhist temple. 20 years later, a smallpox epidemic created a crisis, to which the emperor responded by commissioning the colossal Great Buddha, Daibutsu, at Nara's Todaiji temple. At the same time, the ruler dispatched the Buddhist patriarch Gyiji to Ise shrine to seek the blessing of Amaterasu, the Shinto sun goddess. Gyiji secured a favorable oracle, and the next night the emperor had a dream in which Amaterasu identified herself as the Mahayana Buddha of infinite light, Vairocana. This laid the groundwork for further identification of the various kami as alter egos of various Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. In 750, an image of the Shinto war kami, Hachiman, was transported from its shrine at USA on the island of Kyushu, just south of the main Japanese island, Honshu, to Todaiji in Nara so that the kami might pay respects to the Daibutsu. Hachiman thereafter remained in a special shrine at Todaiji, where he became the guardian kami of Todaiji temple. Thus did a Shinto kami come to protect the teachings of the Buddha. This account reflects an interpretation formulated during the 9th century by teachers of a new esoteric school of Buddhism called Shingon. As always, this theological accommodation had its political implications. and set the stage for many years of Buddhist growth and royal patronage. From then on until 1868, dual Shinto was the dominant form of Shinto. With the Meiji restoration of imperial power came increasing pressure from Shinto scholars to purge the tradition of all Chinese influences, including of course Buddhism and Confucianism, both of which had by turns exerted considerable pull at court for many years.
What is distinctive about Orthodox Judaism?
Emphasis on the direct, verbatim revelation of the Torah to Moses is the foundation of Orthodox Jewish tradition. Rabbinical interpretation of Torah serves the purpose of drawing out the meanings of Scripture so that every situation in life is anchored in divine revelation. If Scripture does not address an issue directly, the rabbi employs traditional principles of exegesis to make what limited adaptations are deemed necessary. Strict observance of the 613 commands and prohibitions contained in the Torah is perhaps the most significant feature of orthodoxy. As an increasingly distinctive approach, orthodoxy began to emerge in 18th century Europe. In response to the perception that Jews were being assimilated too rapidly into society at large, reform attempts to adapt ritual observance in early 19th century Europe elicited a strong reaction on the part of those who refused to acknowledge a need for more than the most minimal adaptation. Orthodox Jews consider their communities a last bastion of tradition in an increasingly secularized world. Just over 1 American Jew out of 10 belongs to an Orthodox synagogue.
Are racial and ethnic issues a significant factor in religion?
Race is just as formative an element in the history of religion as gender. When religious traditions expand beyond their regions of origin, they must adapt to new cultural, racial, and ethnic circumstances. If political power accompanies the tradition's expansion, the social balances in the new territory will very likely call for change in the expanding tradition as well as in the lives of the local populations. What one might call religious colonialism often goes hand in hand with cultural hegemony. When a religious tradition is heavily identified with a racial or ethnic group, converts to the tradition may find themselves still second-class citizens. Within the greater American Christian tradition, for example, black churches formed because of de facto segregation. Even though in theory all Christians enjoy equality in the sight of God.
Are Mormons Christians?
Members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints consider the Bible a critical sacred text. And, as their official name suggests, consider themselves Christians. Anyone who visited the New Mormon Temple in St. Louis prior to its dedication in 1997 would have been impressed. by the prominence of a huge statue of Jesus in the entrance tent. But one of Mormonism's central tenets presents a major problem for mainstream Christian tradition. That tenet is the belief in a prophet after Jesus, with its implication that the revelation of Jesus was not final and definitive. Mormon tradition regards the work of founder and prophet Joseph Smith, Jr. (1805–44) as a necessary corrective to centuries of corruption of the true Christian teaching of Jesus. Smith himself believed the scripture revealed to him, the Book of Mormon. Origin of the popular name of the church did not replace the Bible but merely supplemented it. Today the majority of Mormons live in Utah, while most members of a branch called the Reorganized Church are headquartered in western Missouri.
What is a Swami? Is that anything like a Maharishi?
The term Swami comes from the Sanskrit svami, meaning owner, master. It was originally applied mostly to monastic sannyasis as an acknowledgement of their self-mastery. More recently the term has become a widely used title of reverence. For a broader spectrum of religious scholars, teachers, and renunciants. One often hears Hindu religious leaders referred to as Swamiji, a term of both respect and affection. The term Maharishi, literally great seer, is also an honorific title with roots deep in Hindu mythology. Great seers are individuals celebrated for their profound wisdom. Popular tradition designated as great a number of the ancient seers associated with the communication of primal religious insights. But several historical persons have likewise merited the title. Ramana Maharishi, 1879–1950, attracted a great following in the south of India. Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, BC 1911. Founder of the School of Transcendental Meditation. Gained fame initially as the teacher of the Beatles in Indian spirituality.